So this is a movement, and it's not going to stop. It's going to continue. And once workers realize that they have the power, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We've got Luis Leon from Labor Notes, friend of the show and excellent labor reporter. Really, if you're only going to be reading one person about the UAW's campaign to organize the non-union auto sector, it does need to be Luis and Labor Notes, because he's by far been the best that I've been reading on this, the most consistent and the most well sourced. It's just really been great stuff. So definitely check out his work in Labor Notes. Luis, welcome back to the show. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
So I don't know if you I don't know if you've been listening to the program up to now, but I've been talking about some of the campaign against the union from the company, and you know, of course, there was an enormous campaign from outside of the company, from, you know, the business and political class. But it does seem like, you know, I just didn't hear a lot of that. Just talking about the outside campaign first, from the business class, the politicians and things like this, I did not hear that referenced very much by the workers themselves. Of course, in every single news piece, they always mention it, and they always mention it as a big thing. But talking to the workers, I did not. I don't even know if I can recall a single worker saying that, oh, this was a really big part of the reason that folks ended up voting no. But you were able to talk to more workers over the last week than I was. So what was your perception of the workers' reaction to that campaign from the BCA and the politicians?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think the impact of political interference from Alabama's political and economic class is pretty much creating an environment where workers are just so exhausted and tired and want it to be over. Think about in the political arena when, you know, you're in a primary fight or a presidential fight, and in the run up to the election, things get really intense. A lot of folks, unless you're a partisan of one side, you know, people just tune out. They just give up. They just, can this be over? So I think it has an impact in terms of the global effect of like, what are we, can this just end? So it just exhausts people. People just want it to be over. And I think that's what we saw in terms of where there was more from workers that I talked to at shift change, from workers that I talked to in the run up to the vote. The impact that I heard was most profound was when the Reverend Matthew Wilson visited the plant, and when the company fired the previous CEO, Michael Coble, and Michael Goebel, and brought in a new guy. So it's a classic union busting tactic. And it's a classic because it works. So that's what workers said. I think another factor to highlight here is that unlike the Volkswagen campaign, where we can say that was burnt turf, right? Like they had two previous campaigns plant-wide and a third campaign that they won for a micro unit. In those two plant-wide campaigns, the workers got to see on full display the union busting campaign. They got to see all the tricks. The workers at Mercedes, unfortunately, didn't have that. Murmurs of organizing picked up again in the wake of the pandemic. Workers started talking about a union in 2021, around the time of the Bessemer campaign at Amazon. And then things really picked up in 2022. But they only got to 20% support, and then things just stagnated. So thinking about that as your benchmark of comparison, workers definitely, you know, built up a base of support of 2,000 workers. They were public This was not a campaign where you had 2 or 3 spokespeople. As you yourself know, you went into the union hall and you saw workers, you know, worker leaders talking about their strategy, talking about how they're talking to their coworkers in their department. So this was definitely a worker-led campaign. There was definitely momentum on their side. They were fed up. They were angry. There was strategy from the UAW organizers in terms of comm support. But when you're up against the economic and political class of Alabama and outside of Alabama, all eyes are on you. You know,
Right.
it's a lot. And they, despite incredible organizing and incredible fighters like Jeremy Kimbrell, Detrick Lewis, Deborah Sandifer, Moesha Chandler, um, you know, Robert Lett. There's so many workers. And the reason why I'm naming these folks is because that's what's different about this campaign. That's what's so
Mm.
inspiring about it, is that workers put themselves out there on the line to fight for a union. And whenever anyone steps out into the arena to organize, we have to commend them for that, because the path of least resistance is to keep your head down, especially when everything around you is set up against you. So they
Mm.
have, you know, these workers, the opposition leveled against them was some of it predictable. In all union fights, they do this. Um, but some of it was a little, we hadn't seen in a long time. Like we had not seen a pastor basically come in and preach the
Right.
gospel of the company.
To each to workers individually, like one-on-one, going up and tapping them on the shoulder, whispering to them. I mean, that is kind of bizarre. And so you said that had a profound impact, you feel like. What were some of the workers saying about experiencing that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think some people laughed it off, right? So I think
Mm.
it's a plan of 5,000 people. It was something
Right.
that people registered. Maybe I shouldn't say profound. Don't want to give Reverend Wilson too much credit, lest he gets a GLS SUV out of this. Um, so I think it had an impact because basically you had someone that had unfettered access to the shop
Mm.
floor that can go in one-on-one and talk to you about, make promises, tell you, you know, I know, like the fact that everyone refers to the new CEO by his first name as though he's a pal. Give Federico a chance, you know, and it sounds like a cool name too, like, you know, Federico
Mm.
is not like, I don't know, let me not go there with the German Nazi names, but it's you know it. I think it's just one of the things in the arsenal that starts chipping away at the support. And as you know,
Mm.
Jacob, as yourself a trade unionist, when you file for an election, let's say you file with majority support plus 50%, right, of the plant. A lot of what happens and what the employer tries to do is by any means necessary to chip away at that support bit by bit, you know,
Mm.
until they completely destroy the drive, right? So you think in the scope of everything that happened, in the scope of the captive audience meetings, the letter from the new CEO, the day that voting started on Monday, May 13th, basically saying, give me another chance. Um, all of those things, they just start to accumulate and start to kind of reduce that momentum that workers have.
Mm.
And it starts to cast doubt on, should we do this?
Mm.
And then it seeds confusion and fear. So, and then you have a religious figure come in and kind of pull people aside and whisper into their ears about, you know, this may not be the best decision for you right now, despite the paternalism of telling a worker on the line that he knows best. It does, you know, it does register. So it's the
Mm.
cumulative effect, so much more so than like one individual factor. um and I mean, another factor is that some of the workers that I talked to, you know, they mentioned that there were 2 places where support started to slip. So that was around people that have preferred jobs. So the preferred jobs are people that work in, material handlers and folks that do quality control. So some of these workers, you know, their jobs are, in comparison to the workers on the line, you know, they're a little bit easier. And in a union shop, those jobs are bid for, and usually they go to workers that have seniority, right? Which is as
Mm,
they should. Imagine you put into a plant 25, 30 years. You shouldn't
right.
be, you know, screwing thousands of nuts on the line, you know, break when you already had rotator cuff tears. You know, at that point, the company should take care of you, and you should be able to have a less arduous job assignment, right? What ends up happening with one of the grievances that workers had at Mercedes is that the group leaders would have what was called group leader discretion, meaning that
Mm,
they will give those jobs to their buddies, or
uh,
the people that were kissing the company's ass. You know, those were the ones that would get those jobs. So I think support there was a little shaky, just because of where they stood in terms of the workplace. And then you had folks, I spoke to a young woman who had been at Mercedes for 2 years, and she told me, you know, this is a good job for now, but my ultimate goal is to go into nursing. So I'm not even bothering to vote, you know?
mm,
So, which is something that kind of reminded me when I covered the Amazon campaign in Bessemer, where I heard from the younger workers that, you know, some of them were basically seeing Amazon on the company's terms, like this is a short-term thing, and then I'm out.
mm,
Obviously, Mercedes is a different type of employer. There was a core group of people that had been there for decades, and so that's a different factor. But you still have some of these newer folks that came on. Some of them were pro-union, some of them were not. So I think that those are two areas that I would point to, because ultimately going into the vote, people knew that it was going to be close.
mm,
Um, but there was a sense that they had talked to enough people and were, you know, had tallied up their supporters and had an assessment that they could win. So there was definitely that sense of like, yeah, we're gonna win. It's gonna be close, but we're gonna win. So what ended up happening is that they actually lost some of their supporters, right? So the key question is like, was that attrition attributed to the CEO? What promises did that man make? Because he himself walked the floor. You know, you think of a
mhm,
new CEO, you think they're in meetings with higher ups, but no, this guy was actually behaving like an organizer. He was going
right.
through the plant, having one-on-ones with people. You know, he spoke to thousands of workers one on
Yeah.
one. So at
I
this
don't think
plant,
I've ever
workers.
heard of that before. I don't think I've ever heard of a new CEO. I
Oh,
mean, obviously the new CEO, that's like a common trick, but I don't think I've ever heard of the new CEO coming down and personally talking to thousands of
yeah.
workers. I mean, that's bizarre.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. But it also it's an indication of how scared they were, right?
Right.
They were really scared that the workers, and it shows that they had reason to be scared, right? They
Mm,
have half of their workforce is pro-union.
right.
What is Monday going to look like? Is
Right.
this company going to start retaliating against these workers that stood up courageously? They better not, because they're still going to continue organizing and the UAW is
Mhm.
not going away. This is just a setback, and their leadership will only grow from this. They will only learn from this experience. And 1 year from now, you know, it will be within their power to file again for an election. And
Right.
I was at the Mercedes-Benz training center after when observers from both sides were there. And at one point, the new CEO came up, you know, to Shawn Fain, and you know, Shawn Fain told him, you know, this isn't over.
Mhm.
We'll be the workers are going to come back, and we're going to be there right behind them. And the new CEO said, I know. So you know, they're not taking any they're not hazarding any guess about what the future will hold. They know that they have an empowered workforce, and those workers already won a $2 pay increase. They already eliminated wage which tiers. They fired a CEO. So this already tells you how much you can accomplish when you are organized. What they need now is a collective bargaining agreement so that whatever changes their organization wins them as workers, it's in writing, so it can be taken away when times change, because they will be taken away.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. And that's an important thing to underscore, is that yes, these workers won a lot, and they won a lot not because they had open door meetings with the boss and they asked nicely and the boss is such a nice guy. They got these gains because they stood up and said, we're going to unionize. That's how they got these gains. But every single one of them can be taken away tomorrow. Every single one of them. None of it is guaranteed. None of it's in writing. None of it's binding. Every single one of these is at the whim of the employer, and they can be taken away just as easily and as quickly as they were won. And I want to talk about that a little bit. But going back to, losing support, one of the things that they talked about in the campaign, the workers and their strategy was, and this is, again, like a lot of this for folks who have covered other union elections and who have seen stuff like this, a lot of it's very common and good strategy, both from the company and from the workers, right? And so one of the things that the workers talked about having done is they found leaders in different parts of the company to try to get them to bring along their departments, basically, right? And so Jeremy was talking about yesterday how, in the last week, in the last 10 days, some of these people who had previously been supportive and who had previously, their departments were 100% because they had these natural leaders who were leading everybody to, vote for the union. They stopped hearing back from these leaders. And so it seems like there's kind of an understanding or a guess that there was a real concerted effort, not just to talk to each worker individually, but that they were thinking like organizers and trying to talk to these leaders, whether they're group leaders or natural leaders, and get them to flip their entire departments. Were you able to learn anything more about that effort specifically from the company to flip leaders and get them to flip the rest of their coworkers?
Yeah. I spoke to Brett Garrard, who's been at the company for about 20 years, and he talked that he himself was hauled into one of these meetings with one of the company honchos and basically grilled about the union, right? So, I mean, Brett is a veteran, like a Marine veteran, literally, but also a veteran of previous organizing efforts. And, he could see through the bullshit, right? So he was what I would call like one of the members of the core organizing committee, because the plan is so big. One of the things that Jeremy and others decided early on is that there was going to be a loose structure in terms of like leadership, right? So some of the folks that were in leadership positions in the organizing drive are just people that organically emerged, right? And some of those folks may not have had as much experience with like a boss fight. And when that happened, it seems like it did put fear into their hearts, and they flipped. The union obviously knew that stuff like that was going to happen, right? But how intense it was, how fast it was for 2 weeks, I think it did take the organizing committee by surprise, from what I heard from Jeremy in particular. They did do inoculation. Actually, Jacob Ryan, one of the leaders, went to the Labor Notes conference, to the workshop on inoculation, where you basically prepare inoculations when you prepare your coworkers against what the company will do and say, so that they are not surprised when they pull the classic hits of union busting. So So yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely a factor. And like you said, I think you're right on the money to say that they were effective organizers in kind
Mhm.
of mapping. I think all boss fights actually do this, but people don't always register it, right? Like the captive audience meetings, in addition to just being a psych ops operation, they are also opportunities for the boss to map like who are the leaders.
Mm.
So the people that stand up and are confrontational, they see, okay, these are the public supporters. And then they start, to track that and see, okay, who do they associate with? And that's how they start to kind of break up the networks of support within the plant. So the boss, cannot be like underestimated in the sense that they understand that they want to be the rulers and the workers to be the ruled, and they will
Mm.
do anything that they can to preserve that control. So I often describe the workplace as a dictatorship. So imagine if you're living under a dictatorship and you have the boss has all this access to you. They can bring you into meetings in the mornings before they start working on the line. They have these startup meetings. So what Mercedes did during these startup meetings is that they actually try to poison people's minds instead of talking about health and health concerns or anything,
Mm.
uh, production goals for the day. They were union busting during that time, right? So that's the
Right.
kind of access that the company has. And while these workers are working 10-hour shifts, they can hardly go on vacation. Federico had all the time in the world to just walk the plant
Right.
and talk to workers, right?
Yeah.
So here's where you get at the fundamentally unequal terrain that workers are operating in. So I think that you are absolutely right that the boss, you know, did that and did it to great effect. I mean, I don't want to give also too much credit. There were other things that the boss did that I think are really dumb. Like I think the Wilson ploy, bringing in the Reverend, some workers, the union supporters definitely, laughed it off, and I think this person was not an effective communicator because
Mm.
it created a crisis for him, after
Yeah.
tarnishing Dr. King. Uh,
Right.
in one of the states that is known throughout the world as like the birthplace of like civil rights, of the civil rights struggle. So there were a couple of many more than a couple of missteps on the company side. But again, I think it's just about the war environment that they want to create. And as a whole, it just puts workers in a place where they feel like I am in a dictatorship. I have to submit. And
Right.
workers submitted because that was the message. Like we call the shots. That's what the company we can bring in a reverend to talk to you.
Mm.
We can actually suspend like our startup meetings. We're so
Right.
concerned about production and cranking out 450 cars. But for the sake of busting this union, we're going to stop
Right.
all of that. So it just
Um.
gives people a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And we're talking to Luis Leon from Labor Notes. Just a reminder, we're on the radio, just regarding language and things like that. But you were talking about some of the. I had one more question about the anti-campaign, and there were some. At least one, one of the right-wing rags in the state said that one of the things that potentially, pushed workers away from the union was the drama between the union and Nick Saban and UA and the lawsuit that Tuscaloosa is threatening against the union for use of their trademark and quote unquote misrepresenting Nick Saban's words, which were obviously not misrepresented. They're it is very clear what he was saying, and so that just seems like a bizarre thing to believe to me, but again, you were able to talk to more folks. Did that ever come up?
No, I mean, I think what it came up when Nick Saban first visited the plant that
Mm.
workers, I mean, one worker told me it was a nothing burger in terms of
Right.
describing what it was. I mean, he was vague in his remarks. In terms of going back to the union busting like playbook, I think folks are going to seize on anything, right? To cast doubt, to create confusion. So I think in this instance, that's an example of that. I think that ultimately, with what Nick Saban said was public, as you mentioned. So it was not like it was misused or anything like that. Like that's those are public statements that he made in support of unions.
Right.
And yeah, so yeah, I didn't really hear that. I think what I heard the most was just people feeling like they were just tired and wanted it all to end. That's which I've heard before, like when you get to the end of a
Right.
campaign like this, right? It's just like workers feel like they're being bombarded, like there's like a war, and they're just being bombarded with stuff and they just want it to stop, so that was the effect of it. So when you can bring in outside interest to kind of spread those messages, it just contributes to it. So that's how I would interpret that.
Right, right. So the last question that I have is, you and I know it's obvious, and I think it's obvious to anybody that kind of sits down and thinks about it for a second. These workers, again, they won, real and significant gains in this union campaign. But again, only because of the union campaign. They would not have eliminated two-tier if they did not have this campaign to unionize. They would not have gotten that raise if they had not had this campaign to unionize. None of these things would have happened through an open door policy, talking, playing nice with the boss. None of that would have happened without the campaign. And yet, the workers who voted against the union, they saw all of this. They saw the new CEO, and they said, I want to give this a chance, right? Was there any recognition among the no voters of that reality, that these things would not have happened without the union campaign, that none of the things that everybody was upset about, that everybody was concerned about, none of those things would have changed without the campaign?
Yeah, that's a good point. Ironically, I think some of them credit it, like imagine if you've been, let's say you hired in 2 years ago, and then you start seeing progressively, like once the workers reach 30% in February, the company, announces that they're going to do profit sharing. They're going to eliminate two-tier. If you're not like a pro-labor person that's kind of plugged into the big three strike and all these other things that are happening in the world that have strengthened labor's hand, you might think, oh, wow, the company's doing great. Now, if your timeline is 20 years, you have seen how things have changed. You have seen how you used to have the money that the company gave you for the Mercedes clothes that you have to wear on the line used to be more. When you used to see that there was a night schedule from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. that allowed parents to basically, drop their kids off at school, pick them up, have that family time. Your experience is not, if you've only been at the company for 2 years, your experience is not so much one of the company taking things away as it is one of the company making concessions. So how the company came to make those concessions doesn't really register in some of the anti-union workers' minds. But for a worker that's been there a little longer, they know that their experience at the plant has been one of the company just grinding them down and taking away things. So I think that's the way that I kind of heard it when I spoke to workers. And then there were others that would say, we just want to give the CEO a chance. And if things don't work out, then we can bring the union back,
Right.
So they kind of saw the union as like, okay, the union campaign is going to help us in terms of extracting these concessions. But the other part of that the fact that those concessions can also be taken away as easily as they can be given away if they're not bargained over in a contract, that other piece didn't, register as much. There were some folks that also didn't have, a lot of experience with unions. In terms of southern states, I think Alabama is at 8.6, 8.7 in terms of its workers that are members of unions. But some of these workers didn't have familiarity, with unions. And I think there is something to be said about, as much as we love the labor movement, as much as we want positive coverage of the labor movement, in Alabama, is not, besides the great work that you are doing, Jacob, and others, there's just not that many pro-worker voices out there that are talking about ceding some power to workers on the shop floor, so that there's a democracy and not this dictatorship that I described. And I think that that has an impact, right? So that's something that I'd be curious to hear more about, like what was people's understanding really of unions and the labor movement beyond the core organizers that obviously were following the Big Three strike. For the majority of the folks that were supporters, what was their sense of a union?
Right. Yeah, well, I'm sure that we'll that more of that will come out over the coming days, and look forward to doing what we can to continue educating folks about unions and unionization. But it's a real problem that you've identified. I mean, AL.com, the biggest news site, the biggest news source in the entire state, the person who covers labor for them is the business reporter, right? I mean, it's just such a farce. And, again, AL.com, on in conservative spaces is considered a socialist rag, right? But they have a business reporter covering labor stuff, who doesn't understand the NLRA. I mean, there's been procedural issues that I've seen in his reporting that he just, doesn't, and which is not to say that I think he's malicious necessarily, but he just doesn't know, right? He just doesn't know, and that's a problem. That even if you're, it would be better to just have neutral reporters who understand anything about labor and unions and worker power and things like this. And we just don't have that. There's a new reporting intern at the Alabama Political Reporter that I'm excited about. He's been doing some good stuff, so hopefully he'll continue and continue to do good worker reporting. But yeah, it's a real problem. Luis Leon from Labor Notes. Anything else before we let you go?
Yeah, no, I think I think this is a setback, and I think we have to continue backing up these workers.
That's right. Folks, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you about Hyundai. Yeah, I know that you're in contact with some workers from Hyundai. And I think yesterday you said that you had heard from some of them. How have they been reacting, and has this had any effect on their campaign that you can tell so far?
No, I think they're all committed. This is the thing. The UAW has, received a surge of cards. The momentum has not stalled because of this. Workers still are fed up. They still want to change their workplace. The question is, are they going to talk to their coworkers and get to that 30%, 50%, 70%? Because basically it's in their hands where they want to take this, right? This is what the UAW has emphasized. So the playbook at Mercedes will be revised, updated, and workers will share it with one another. So what I can say is that the Hyundai workers are talking to the Mercedes workers. The Mercedes workers in Alabama are talking to the ones in South Carolina, the ones at BMW in South Carolina. So this is a movement, and it's not going to stop. It's going to continue. And once workers realize that they have the power, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle.
Luis Leon from Labor Notes, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.